Everybody at some point in their life has had a nightmare. And some of us have had nightmares that are so intense, so scary that it sticks with us for the rest of our days. But what if those nightmares came true? What if the nightmares you had could affect you in real life? That is what one movie in 1984 made us wonder. What if when you died in your dreams, you died in real life? A Nightmare on Elm Street is seen as one of the most classic 80s horror films. It's been referenced throughout pop culture since its creation, with its core villain, Freddy Krueger, becoming such a huge icon that even Will Smith wrote a song about him. It's often viewed as the movie that made horror director Wes Craven a household name, much like Halloween did for John Carpenter. And still to this day, it's considered one of the scariest movies ever made for many people, myself included. But what makes Nightmare on Elm Street such a good film? And if this movie were to be released today, would audiences still be as responsive as they were back in the 80s? Hi, my name is Shay, and welcome to a new series I'm starting here on Creepy Critiques called Does This Deserve to Be a Classic? This is the series where I examine from my unprofessional point of view if a movie that many audiences regard as a classic piece of cinema has earned its status as such. Now, I want to be transparent. I'm not a film expert. I didn't go to school for this, and I've never worked in the film industry. Largely, what this series will focus on is an audience member's point of view on a classic film. This series will not just focus on horror films, although that is my bread and butter, but any film from the 90s and earlier that audiences believe are classics. And also, the majority of these movies I'll be covering are movies that I absolutely love. Like, in particular, A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and Freddy Krueger is my favorite horror villain right after Ghostface. I mean, I got the poster back there, so I mean no hatred when I speak on these films, and any critiques I give are just from a place of understanding what modern audiences tend to like, and not on the movie's quality itself unless stated otherwise. These videos will be formatted in this way. We'll start with a brief recap of the story overall. Think of it as a speed run. Go into how the film impacted pop culture as a whole after its release. Talk about how modern audiences would view this film if it were released today, and then end on the note of whether or not this film itself deserves to be a classic. If any of that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing to this channel because I will be making a lot more videos like this as time goes by. I also do have other series. I do have a series where I watch movies from like many different franchises, and I compare them all and talk about what makes it good or bad. And then I also have series regarding theme park stuff, so be on the lookout for that. We've got a lot to cover today though, so without further ado, let's get into this creepy critique. So if you've never seen any Nightmare on Elm Street movie ever in your life, you might want to skip this video entirely, because this video is going to be nothing but spoilers. For those of you who have seen this movie, I'm not going to go deep into this film. This is going to be a very quick, very basic rundown of this movie to just hit some beats I might want to talk about later on. A Nightmare on Elm Street was released on November 9th, 1984, and was written and directed by Wes Craven. It centers around a group of teenagers, Tina, Rod, Glenn, and final girl Nancy, who are being stalked in their dreams by a burnt man wearing a glove with knives for fingers named Freddy Krueger. After Tina brings up having the nightmares, her three friends join her to keep her company while her mom is working late. Unfortunately for Tina, even having her friends there doesn't protect her from Freddy's wrath, and she is dispatched while sleeping next to her boyfriend Rod. Considering that Rod has a nasty temper and a criminal record, he's the initial suspect for the murder, but Nancy knows better since she's also been having dreams about the burnt man with knives for fingers. Despite this, no one believes Nancy as she tries to save Rod from dying by Freddy's hand. Unfortunately, she's too late, and Rod is also dispatched by Freddy in his dreams. From that point on, Nancy makes it a point to try her hardest not to fall asleep, despite her mother constantly begging her to get some rest. When she does accidentally fall asleep, she's constantly plunged into Freddy's nightmare world, but when she realizes that she can actually bring him into the real world after she grabbed his hat in her dream, she devises a plan to get him into the real world and get him arrested for the crimes that he's committed against her friends. The adults still don't believe her, and eventually Nancy's mom tells her the truth about Fred Krueger. As it turns out, Freddy was a man who was kidnapping and harming children in the neighborhood. Once the adults found out, they did a little street justice, and Freddy was no more. Nancy's mom assures her that Freddy can't hurt her anymore by showing her that she took his knives, or, the glove. But Nancy isn't buying that. She decides to go forward with her plan of bringing Freddy into the real world for that beatdown. However, when she tries to get support from Glenn, both her and his family block her from doing so. Her mother bars up the windows and doors so she can't get out of the house in determination to get her to get some sleep, and Glenn's parents take the phone off the hook so she can't call him. This proves to be detrimental as Glenn eventually falls asleep, and we get one of the most iconic kills in the history of horror movies ever, the Fountain of Blood. I can't show it, unfortunately, because YouTube would have a cow, but Glenn is sucked into his bed and a literal geyser of blood then shoots out of the hole he was sucked into. It is gnarly. Once Nancy realizes that Freddy killed Glenn, she's ready to tangle with him from here on out. She falls asleep, grabs him, and brings him into our world. Then she escapes to get her dad to come and arrest him, only to find that Freddy decided to take her mother instead. As Nancy and her father reconcile with the loss of their matriarch, Nancy knows she'll have to confront Freddy one last time. So she does so by telling him that he's not real. She gave him too much power by obsessing over him, and nothing that's happened to her, her friends, and her family is real. She then exits her parents' room to a sunny afternoon outside. Her mother and friends are alive, and everything seems to be perfect. Until she gets in the car with Glenn, Rod, and Tina, and the doors lock, the windows roll up, and the top comes over the car to reveal Freddy's iconic red and green colors. As Nancy screams to her mom for help, her mother waves until... well, let me just show you how goofy this ending is. To say this movie was successful is a huge understatement. When it officially released on November 16th worldwide, it was a colossal hit, and during its runtime, it made $57 million worldwide. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be over $169 million, which is pretty good for a indie horror film, essentially. Review-wise, it was fairly well received. Many considered Craven to have been in a creative slump at the time when the film was released, and since New Line Cinema was struggling to put out a hit, this revived both the directors and the studio's careers. In fact, fun fact I didn't include in the script, I have heard New Line Cinema used to call themselves the house that Freddy built. I love that. As of right now, it sits at a 95% approval rating from Rotten Tomatoes, which is huge if anyone knows anything about how they tend to work. The film also made Robert Englund, who famously played Freddy, a staple in the horror genre and gave him more opportunities for various different roles. You can also say that it launched Johnny Depp's career, but I don't think that this was the movie that made him famous. However, this was his first movie, so there's that. Also, sorry if you just heard somebody revving their engine. A lot of people think that they're in the Fast and the Furious in my neighborhood. It has featured on Bravo's The 100 Scariest Movie Moments, a special that I watched quite frequently when I was in high school. It was voted 162nd on Empire's 500 Greatest Movies of All Time list in 2008, and it was also part of the New York Times Best 1,000 Movies Ever Made list as well. It's obvious that this movie has had a huge cultural impact. Now, I'm not going to be able to go over every single piece of media that this movie has touched. If I did that, I'd probably be here for hours and it would be a very boring video. So here's just a few I can personally think of off the top of my head and with a little research. So obviously there have been numerous sequels and spin-offs and one remake. In total, there's 9 movies in this franchise altogether. In the mainline franchise, there's been 7. Then there was Freddy vs. Jason. Wow, I'm gonna leave that in because that's funny. There was Freddy vs. Jason, a spin-off movie that came out where it pitted Friday the 13th Jason Voorhees against Freddy Krueger. And then the 2010 remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street, which we will talk about a little bit later. So from 1984 to 1994, there were 7 movies released. That is a decade-long franchise that's run, which is impressive. While the original movies were coming out, there were actually novels also releasing, which I just found out about this while researching. In total, there are 13 books written about this franchise, with most following the stories of each film that's been released. And I'm sorry, Vin Diesel keeps revving his engine outside of my window. I don't know if you guys can hear that. This mic is pretty good at not picking up background noise, but it is a little distracting for me that Vin Diesel's outside of my window right now doing the Fast 10 Part 2 movie or something. Of course, there were also multiple comic book companies that released their own versions of the story, and there was actually one released by Marvel Comics. So, Freddy Krueger in the MCU, anyone? Aside from the franchise movies and books, there have been 3 documentaries that have been made, with the biggest one being Never Sleep Again, which talks about the filmmaking experience for this movie. Several actors from the franchise have also created documentaries of their own, including my personal favorite, which I saw on Shudder, and I believe it's still on Shudder, from Mark Patton, who was in the second movie, Freddy's Revenge, called Scream Queen: My Nightmare on Elm Street. Awesome documentary. I cannot recommend it enough, because if you were like me and you watched Freddy's Revenge and you were like, this movie's kind of cringe, watching this documentary put that movie in a whole new light for me, and I actually really love Freddy's Revenge now. It's one of my favorite sequels. Of course, there's also tons of merchandise. You know, I got the hoodie, it's not a hoodie, the sweater on. There was pop figures and action figures, the like, all of it. Freddy has also been in numerous video games, and there are actually 2 Nightmare on Elm Street video games. The first was released on the NES in 1989. This game centered around 4 players collecting the bones of Freddy to throw in a furnace and burn in order to defeat him. The second was a role-playing PC game where you can play as several characters, including Nancy, in a task to save Joey and defeat Freddy. But I think my favorite Freddy Krueger appearance in a video game was actually as a special fighter in Mortal Kombat 9. One of his fatalities is basically the Glenn kill from the end of the original film, and I love that for him. A Nightmare on Elm Street, or at the very least, Freddy Krueger has been mentioned in songs and even shown up in music videos. I won't go over every single one here, but there are actually 2 songs about the movie itself. One I mentioned earlier is A Nightmare on My Street by The Fresh Prince and DJ Jazzy Jeff, which is an absolute bop. The first time I actually heard this song was when I was working at Spirit Halloween, and I didn't know it existed, and my siblings were laughing at me when I saw them, and I was like, bro, did you guys know that Will Smith made a song about Freddy Krueger? And they're like, duh. So I thought that was hilarious, but it's about going to see the movie with some friends and then at the end getting stalked by Freddy. It's just peak Will Smith, man. And then, of course, there's The American Nightmare by Ice Nine Kills, who, if you don't know them, pretty much make music inspired by popular horror franchises. This was actually, for me, the second song I ever heard from them when I was first introduced. The first song I ever heard was their song based off the It movie, because I was really into it at the time, and a friend of mine sent me that song and was like, this is right up your alley. And I was like so floored that the very thing I did as soon as I finished listening to that song was run to Spotify and bring up their track list. And then I saw The American Nightmare. I was like, is this Nightmare on Elm Street? And I put it on, and right as I put it on, it started playing. I was like, it is! I got so excited. So yeah, that's how I became a big fan of this band. It even includes the Hopscotch song, like I don't want to sing it too much, but the 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, but they do their own spin on it, which I really like. And it happens right before the breakdown. If you listen to metal, you know the breakdown I'm talking about, or like hardcore, I should say. They're not really metal, but if you listen to like hardcore music, you know the breakdown I'm talking about. And it's a really good build up. Saw them in concert last year, and I definitely headbanged hard at that part. Side note, this is not the last time I will mention this band on this channel. I can promise you that, because they come into play in almost everything I'm going to talk about. They're everywhere for me. Last but not least, as you can imagine, tons and tons of shows and movies have referenced or mentioned A Nightmare on Elm Street in their own way. Again, can't go over every single reference because I don't even think I could logically find them all, but 2 of my favorites are in the same film, and it's also a Wes Craven film. If you're a horror fan, you know where this is going. So there are actually 2 references to Craven's Golden Goose in the movie Scream. One is actually one of the shirts that Tatum is wearing in one scene. It's the exact same shirt, pretty much. Like, not the same shirt, but like the same shirt, if it makes sense, as the one Glenn was wearing before he became Bed Soup. It's got like the crop top and the 10. I'll put a picture of it so you guys can see it. But she was wearing that exact style of shirt, and I think that's really a nice little nod that I didn't even pick up on until many years later when I saw it like on YouTube, and someone was like, she's wearing the same shirt as Glenn, and I was like, I didn't put 2 and 2 together, because I'm usually so focused at the end of A Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm usually so focused on the Bed Soup that I'm not paying attention to what Glenn is wearing in that moment. The second is actually my favorite part of like the Scream movie. Is pretty silly, but the scene where Principal Himbry has the ghost face mask and he's constantly holding it up and he's freaking himself out, and he hears some noises in the hallway and he pops out of the hallway and he's like, you little shits, and there's a janitor in the hallway that's mopping, and he's got a fedora on and a red and green sweater on, and he looks up at Principal Himbry and he's like, what did you call me? And Himbry's like, I think he said something like, not you, Fred, or like, oh, not you, Fred, or like, sorry, Fred, or something like that. So the janitor's name was Fred. And when I first saw Scream, like, obviously I'd already seen the entirety of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and I was a huge fan of the franchise. So when I first ever saw Scream, which was in like 2011, or it was either 2011 or 2012. I know it was one of those 2 years that I finally sat down and watched Scream. That part had me rolling. I was like, that was so good. Like, such a good nod to like that franchise. And especially because we know that A Nightmare on Elm Street is technically canon in the Scream universe, because in the beginning when Casey Becker is talking to Ghostface, she mentions that like he says that he names off his movie, and she's like, he has her name off like what she thinks his favorite scary movie is, and he's like, and she's like, oh, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and he's like, is that the one with the guy with the knives for fingers? And she's like, yeah, and he's like, yeah, I like that one. It was scary or whatever. I love that. Like we know it's canon in the universe, so I'm almost like, maybe the janitor was like, my name's Fred. I saw an opportunity to like dress up as Freddy Krueger today. But I don't know. It's a nice little nod to the franchise that kind of built Wes Craven's career overall. Almost forgot to mention, and this is more for us haunted house fans, Freddy has actually been used at Halloween Horror Nights twice before, and I have seen him both times. Once in 2007 at the Carnival of Carnage. His house was actually the only house I made it through that night. There was two houses. It was that one and Dead Silence. It was the only one I made it through that night before I tapped out and I said I couldn't do it anymore. And then again during the 25th anniversary, they had a Freddy versus Jason house based off of the movie. And also, personal fun fact, I still have the Carnival of Carnage shirt that my brother brought me in 2007 with Freddy, Jason, and Leatherface on it. But it is covered in bleach now because I wore it while dyeing my hair once, and now it's just become my hair dye shirt. So now that we've covered the impact the film had on pop culture, as you can see, there's a lot of it. So let's move on to the question of, how would this movie be received if it were released today? So, in this section, I want to discuss whether or not I think this movie is something that would be well received if released today. Setting aside the special effects, which definitely don't translate well in today's society, and the cheesy acting, this is more of an overview of the themes in today's society and whether a movie could survive through the lens of what I consider to be a harsher modern audience. We'll start with the simple one. Is this movie something that many would consider scary? If this was released in this day and age, I think it would be a movie that's considered scary. In fact, this is where I go to the remake. Yes, I am going to defend the 2010 remake, but hear me out before you click off the video in a rage. If the original Nightmare on Elm Street did not exist, I don't think this movie would have been hated as much as it is. The 2010 remake is fantastic if you actually don't think about the original movie. I know that might be an extremely hard thing for some of you to do because of what it's stacked up against, but it actually is. It's gory. You get to see the actual effects on a person's brain and body when they don't sleep. Like the pharmacy scene when she's glitching going between the dream world and the real world is like one of my favorite scenes in any horror movie to this day, because oh my god, I cannot imagine being in that state of delusion where you're not even sure what's real and this slasher is stalking you in another world that no one else can see and they can't help you. Like, that is such a scary thought, and I'm so mad that it was wasted on this movie. You have a heartbreaking story where Freddy could have been innocent, and honestly, if they retconned the ending where he did actually harm the kids when they were younger, and it turned out to be that the parents had acted on paranoia, the movie would have been 10 times better, personally. And despite many people not liking Jackie Earle Haley's performance as Freddy, I think his performance was reminiscent of the Freddy we got in the original first movie. The one that wasn't super jokey and was incredibly creepy overall. In my opinion, he brought back the fear to Freddy Krueger, who had long since become a joke in the world of slashers. If this movie was the only iteration we ever got of A Nightmare on Elm Street, I think it would have done better than it did review-wise because it had a lot going for it. That alone tells me that if this movie were released today, it would still scare the crap out of most audiences because the story itself is just terrifying. There's always been this idea that you're safe in your bed while you sleep, but this movie takes that security and safety you feel and turns it upside down. Next would be, does the plot align morally with what a lot of audiences are consuming? Honestly, yes. For for the most part. In horror, there's always going to be something that upsets audiences, and while in the past I have seen some horror fans lambast people for saying that this is their favorite series, like overall, it is par for the course when it comes to horror. The main problem is with its villain, Freddy. While in the original 1984 movie it's never explicitly stated, Freddy Krueger is, well, he's a very bad man to kids. I can't say it because of YouTube, but if you know, you know. Now, I can commend the original series for never showing this type of behavior towards children on screen, but for many people, even the implication is far too much. Would that cause controversy with modern audiences? I believe personally that casual fans may not like it very much, but I think people who consume horror content will understand that's part of what makes this story so unnerving. I don't think it would cause a huge controversy if the director handled it the same way that the film did in 1984. Don't show it, just explain. That's really all we need as an audience. And finally, would this movie even be considered good? Personally, I think so, because this film could really work in any style if you stop and you think about it. It could be a super campy B-rated horror flick that gets a limited release and slasher fans will eat it up. It could be a deep dive into the psyche of the teens being played by Freddy in an A24 style horror flick. It could even fall in between those and just be a popcorn flick that plays it straight and doesn't take itself too seriously or go too far with the comedy like the 2010 remake did. I think no matter which way a director and writer wanted to take A Nightmare on Elm Street, if it were an original concept in 2024, it would be well received by whatever target audience it wanted to reach. The story can be incredibly engaging when done right. The concept of the villain is unsettling, and even Final Girl Nancy is a character we can root for throughout the film. I think modern audiences would immediately latch onto this film, and it would earn its place in horror history. So, now we're on to the big question. Does A Nightmare on Elm Street deserve to be a classic? And in my opinion, yes. This film still holds up to the scare factor even 40 years later. And yes, this year is the 40th anniversary of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I just realized that as I was writing this script. Oh my god, where's the time gone? The cast of characters are still engaging to watch. Nancy is an amazing final girl, while Freddy is a truly terrifying villain. The kills are creative, gory, and unsettling, and the overall concept of this movie is just so well done that it's honestly impossible not to love it for me. This is a movie that has had such a huge impact on horror cinema, and even just cinema in general, that to this day it is still something that people can reference within media and pop culture. And it's also something that I think can translate well with modern audiences. While some movies from the 80s have not aged well at all, the same can't be said for A Nightmare on Elm Street. I think this film has more than earned its title as a movie classic. And there you have it, folks. My take on whether or not A Nightmare on Elm Street deserves to be a classic. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you agree, disagree, what have you. Follow me on Creepy Critiques on all socials, except Twitter, because no, I'm most active on Threads. Most of my activeness is shit posting, but you know, it's Threads. It's unhinged right now. No one's really taking it seriously like they are every other platform. And definitely subscribe to see more videos like this going forward. Thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you next time for another Creepy Critique.